There are people who start well, but they end very badly. There are people who seem to have a bright and promising future, but their stories end in a melancholy and tragic way. Imagine someone to whom God gave a lot to your hands. Much, to be more accurate, someone who was raised by the Lord as a prince about his chosen people. A man whom God tore the kingdom of David's house and handed him. And then, after all this man managed to be worse than all who were before him. Someone who was so despicable to the point that his offspring be compared by God to a bunch of manure. The man we are talking about is Jeroboam, the first king of the northern tribes of Israel. Jeroboam. Its story could have been marked by glory and blessing from the Lord, but it became a narrative of tragedy and warning, so that it can be seen in the Bible as an example of how the disobedience and idolatry can destroy not only an individual's life, but also affect an entire nation. Thusly, for many Bible readers, the name of Jeroboam I is synonymous with apostasy and divine judgment. However, before we reach these conclusions, we need to understand Jeroboam's complete trajectory, from its performance during the reign of King Solomon, passing by its rise to the throne of the northern kingdom, to his sins, and the complete ruin of his dynasty due to God's judgment. And that's exactly what we'll talk about in this video. Jeroboam was an Ephraimite of humble origin, son of Naters and Azariah. Ephraim's tribe was one of the most influential among the northern and Jeroboam tribes grew in a hard work environment and dedication. The Bible does not mention much about his family besides the fact that his mother was a widow, suggesting that Jeroboam may have faced difficulties early on. Already adult, Jeroboam stood out for his diligence, skill, and leadership. King Solomon recognized these qualities and designated him as the supervisor of the workers of Joseph's house. That is, the leader of the working group of the Ephraim and Manasseh tribes. One day, while Jeroboam was out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahaz, the Silonite, met with him. There was dressed in a new cloak, and when he met Jeroboam, he tore the cloak into 12 pieces, handing 10 of them to Jeroboam. This symbolic action represented the imminent division of the kingdom of Israel. In this sense, Ahaz's prophecy was clear. God had decided to divide the kingdom of Israel because of Solomon's sins, which had deviated to idolatry, influenced by his many foreign wives. But God's message through Ahaz included an important and conditional promise. God promised that if Jeroboam would obey his commandments and follow his ways, as David had made, he would establish a lasting dynasty for Jeroboam. In other words, God promised to Jeroboam a firm dynasty in Israel, just as he had promised David. This was a promise of greatness and stability, but it was conditioned to obedience and faithfulness to God. The news of Ahaz's prophecy and the growing influence of Jeroboam reached Solomon's ears. Fearing a revolt and the loss of part of his kingdom, Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam. And to escape the wrath of the king, Jeroboam fled to Egypt, where he found refuge with Pharaoh. This escape to Egypt marked a period of exile and preparation, where apparently Jeroboam kept the right moment to return and claim God's promise. Then, after the death of Solomon, his son Rehoboam ascended to the throne of Israel. However, Rehoboam faced an immediate challenge. The northern tribes were dissatisfied with the heavy loads imposed by Solomon in their last years. For those who do not know, King Solomon even used the forced work of the Israelites themselves to build his kingdom majestic. This caused a growing dissatisfaction among the people. Jeroboam then returned from Egypt and joined the leaders of the northern tribes in search of a reduction in workload and taxes, appealing to Rehoboam for relief. Rehoboam asked 3 days to consider the issue and sought the council of elders who had served his father, Solomon. The elders advised Rehoboam to be a servant of the people, relieving their loads to gain their loyalty. However, Rehoboam ignored this wise counsel and chose to follow the guidance of young people who grew up with him, deciding to further increase the bales of the people. Obviously, Rehoboam's response was received with indignation. The northern tribes rejected their leadership, proclaiming that they had no inheritance in David's lineage. And with that, the 10 northern tribes broke with the Davidic dynasty, leaving Rehoboam with only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. It was in this context that Jeroboam was crowned king over the northern kingdom of Israel. After establishing his kingdom on the 10 northern tribes, Jeroboam concentrated efforts on the fortification of several strategic cities. This measure aimed to protect his kingdom against possible invasions and consolidate his territorial domain. Among the fortified cities were Sikkim, in the mountainous region of Ephraim, where he initially established his capital, and Penuel, east of Jordan. The construction and fortification of these cities indicated Jeroboam's concern with the defense and security of his kingdom in the face of external and internal threats. The division of that kingdom did not result in a peaceful relationship with the southern kingdom. There was constant tension between Jeroboam, king of Israel, and Rehoboam, king of Judah. Rehoboam initially even planned a war to regain the northern tribes, mobilizing a great force military. However, he was dissuaded by Shemaiah, the man of God, who received a word from the Lord instructing him not to fight against his Israeli brothers. Nevertheless, minor conflicts continued to occur during the reigns of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. But after the death of Rehoboam, his son Abias climbed the throne of Judah, and the conflict between the two kingdoms persisted, culminating in a significant battle during the reign of Abias. According to the report of the second book of Chronicles in chapter 13, Abias faced Jeroboam in a great battle. The biblical text says that at that time Abias joined an army of 400,000 men, while the army of Jeroboam reached twice this number. Abias, trusting God's promise to the house of David, stated that the Lord was on the side of Judah. And though Jeroboam had a higher army, Abias inflicted a great defeat to the army of Israel, killing 500,000 Israeli men. But before that, Jeroboam might have still had to deal with the Egyptian threat to his territory. This is because during the reign of Jeroboam, Shishak, pharaoh of Egypt, he invaded the kingdom of Judah in the 5th year of Rehoboam. Shishak looted Jerusalem and took the treasures of the temple and the royal palace. Although the biblical account does not directly mention an invasion of Shishak to the kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam, Egypt is likely to have influenced and impacted both kingdoms. Even other historical sources point to Israeli cities among the places conquered by the Egyptian. Already in the last years of his reign, Jeroboam continued to govern with a focus on maintaining the power and stability of his kingdom. But his leadership was constantly marked by idolatry and disobedience to God. His reign was a period of spiritual and moral decline for Israel. Jeroboam reigned for 22 years, but his legacy was stained by the sins he committed and the idolatry he settled. In fact, to understand Jeroboam's tragic end, we need to consider the way idolatry developed under his government. King Jeroboam, fearing may the continuous pilgrimage of the people to Jerusalem to worship in the temple weaken their reign, took drastic measures to consolidate their power. He ordered 2 golden calves, telling the people that it was a lot of work for the Israelites to rise to the temple in Jerusalem. And those calves were the gods who took Israel out of Egypt. This reference to the Exodus, where Aaron made a golden calf while Moses was on Mount Sinai, was not just a strategic error, but a direct violation of the first and second commandments that prohibit the worship of other gods and the creation of sculpted images. Some Old Testament scholars argue that Jeroboam tried to implant in Israel the Mesopotamian worship to the calf of pre-Abrahamic days, just as Aaron had done in the desert. Then Jeroboam perverted the cult of the Lord and established 2 main worship centers in Bethel and Dan, strategically located in the south and north of his kingdom, respectively. Bethel had a significant spiritual history, being the place where Jacob had his view of the stairs to heaven. Edom was one of the northernmost cities of Israel. In doing so, Jeroboam diverted the focus of the worship of Jerusalem, the spiritual center designated by God. King Jeroboam not only created idols and centers of worship, but also violated God's orders about priesthood. He named the priests among all people and not just the Levites, the tribe designated by God to serve in the priesthood. Therefore, this action disregarded the divine ordinance and established an illegitimate priesthood, compromising the purity and holiness of the worship of God. In addition, Jeroboam instituted a party in the 8th month, on the 15th day, imitating the Tabernacles festival that was observed in the 7th month. This change in the date was not authorized by God and represented another effort by Jeroboam to create a parallel religious system, maintaining control over the people and driving them away from true worship prescribed by the Lord. Jeroboam's decision to establish these false cults was deliberate and well-planned. He reasoned that by providing places of more convenient worship, he would guarantee the loyalty of his people. However, this strategic plan ignored Jerusalem's centrality as God chosen for his temple, and the importance of following divine instructions on worship. But it is important to know that Jeroboam had the opportunity to convert from his bad way. God, in his mercy and righteousness, sent a prophet of Judah to confront Jeroboam and denounce his sins. This man of God, whose name is not mentioned in the scriptures, was tasked with going to Bethel, where Jeroboam was offering sacrifices on the altar he had built himself. Upon arriving in Bethel, the prophet of Judah cried against the altar by order of the Lord. He announced that a descendant of David named Josiah would be born and desecrated that altar, burning human bones on him. As a sign that his message was true, the prophet stated that the altar would crack and the ashes would pour out. When Jeroboam heard the prophecy, he reached out against the prophet and ordered him to be arrested. However, the king's hand dried himself, and he could not collect it. At the same time, the altar cracked, and the ashes poured itself, according to the word of the Lord uttered by the prophet. Frightened and humiliated, the man of God then prayed, and the king's hand was restored. This act of mercy contrasted with the message of judgment and revealed God's willingness to hear prayer and show grace, even in the midst of judgment. But then, about 300 years later, during the reign of Josiah, the prophecy pronounced by the man of God of Judah was fulfilled. Josiah, a reforming king, he performed a great purification in the territory of Judah and Israel. He destroyed the idolatrous altars and profaned the places of pagan worship. Josiah arrived in Bethel and burned the bones of the idolatrous priests on the altar instituted by Jeroboam, just as the prophet of Judah had predicted. Jeroboam's sin had devastating spiritual consequences for Israel. In introducing idolatry, he led the people to sin against God in a blatant and continuous manner. This removal from true worship has established a pattern of infidelity that lasted generations, contributing to the eventual fall of the northern kingdom. Even in the days of Jeroboam, the Lord announced through the prophet Ahaz to sloop the fall of the northern kingdom and the exile of its inhabitants because of idolatry. In the context of this prophecy, Jeroboam's tragic end was also declared. In fact, the biblical narrative of God's judgment on Jeroboam begins with the disease of his son, Abias. Worried about boy's health, Jeroboam sent his disguised wife to consult the prophet Ahaz in Silo. Perhaps Jeroboam had his conscience heavy for the sins committed and thought that if his wife disguised, the Lord's prophet could prophesy something positive about his family. Jeroboam's wife arrived at the house of Ahaz, but the prophet, although blind due to age, was warned by God about her arrival and the nature of her mission. The message Ahaz had for her was of judgment and condemnation for both Jeroboam and his family. In other words, the prophet was not deceived by the king's disguise and announced God's judgment on the house of Jeroboam. According to the biblical text, Ahaz delivered a tough and clear message. Because of Jeroboam's sins, and because he led Israel to sin, God would bring misfortune over his family. The prophet announced that all the men in his house would be exterminated, and that his descendants would be swept down as manure until there is nothing to remain. The prophecy still included an immediate signal. As soon as Jeroboam's wife came home and entered the city, her son Abias would die. And as announced by the prophet, it happened, and all Israel mourned for the boy. Abias was the only one in the house of Jeroboam to receive a decent burial. For in him was found something good to the Lord. The other members of Jeroboam's family would have their bodies devoured by dogs in the city or birds in the countryside, a sign of extreme humiliation and shame. In fact, the total destruction of Jeroboam's house was later fulfilled, when Baza from the tribe of Issachar conspired against Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, and killed him. Nadab had been the son who succeeded Jeroboam on the throne of Israel. But his reign lasted only 2 years. Baras exterminated the whole house of Jeroboam, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord pronounced by Ahaz. This event marked the end of the Jeroboam dynasty, the king who became known in biblical history as he who made Israel sin. The biblical text does not describe specifically how Jeroboam's death occurred, but it is assumed that this occurred shortly after the death of his son Abias. Another curiosity is that in the Old Testament's Hebrew text, the name of Jeroboam's wife is not quoted, but in a version of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, Jeroboam's story calls us to serious reflection on how the decisions we make, especially those involving our faithfulness to God, shape our history and impact those around us. We live in a time when integrity and faithfulness are constantly challenged by external and internal pressures. Thus, as we study Jeroboam's life, we must ask ourselves, are we looking for God's way, or are we leading by our own desires and fears? The story of Jeroboam and the judgment pronounced against him, they emphasize the righteousness of God. Although God is merciful and long-term, judgment about Jeroboam is a demonstration of God's holiness and his intolerance to sin. Jeroboam, as Israel's leader, had a responsibility to guide the people in the true worship of God. In instituting idolatry, he not only sinned personally, but led the whole nation to sin. This fact reminds us that spiritual leaders have a tremendous influence, and, when corrupted, can cause great spiritual damage. Then, in a way, the story of Jeroboam is also a warning to all leaders about the importance of remaining faithful to God and their commandments, as they will be charged more rigorously. But even in the midst of judgment, there is a glimpse of God's grace in the history of Jeroboam's house. Abias, the son of Jeroboam, was distinguished because in him was found something good for the Lord. This reminds us that God is able to discern and reward goodness, even in contexts of great iniquity. God's mercy is a constant theme in the Bible, offering hope of redemption even in the darker circumstances. Then God's judgment on Jeroboam and the subsequent ruin of his house are reminders of divine holiness and justice. Therefore, the history of Jeroboam teaches us about the seriousness of sin, the responsibility of spiritual leadership, and the importance of a life of faithfulness and obedience to the Lord. Now, write in the comments if you already knew the story of Jeroboam. And if you want to grow even more in knowledge of God's Word, you can study theology with us totally online from anywhere through video lessons, handouts, and certificate of completion. The information is in the video description and the first comment fixed.